Hi, welcome to Funny Old World. I'm Simon London. And so, why did we do this podcast? Well, we were going to do a podcast just simply about good news because during the pandemic, everything was so negative. But once you start looking at good news stories, you realize that they're a little bit trite. And actually, what's interesting are those stories that don't really make the news and are kind of anecdotal and have their own sort of history behind them. And so looking at stories like that we could talk about, discuss, dissect, and even get some of the characters involved in those stories to join us and talk about them as well seemed like a great idea, didn't it, Juliet?
Yes, indeed. Hi, Simon London. I'm Juliet Kinsman. I've been a journalist and a broadcaster of sorts, occasional broadcaster, for more than 2.5 decades, which always makes me feel like when I say that, I should be drawing my pension soon. Maybe I will be by the time we come out of lockdown. No. So I am a journalist. What does that mean? It means I'm a storyteller. And I think that not enough inspiring positive stories are shared. Um, I think that exactly as you said, we talk about current affairs and news in a way that is all about spiking the cortisol, making us more stressed. And I really love sharing stories that are interesting. And, just as the village elders would have sat around the campfire, sharing stories that make us maybe think a little bit more deeply, have a slightly shift our perspectives, perhaps approach life with a bit more wisdom. Tell me a story.
Okay, so it
This
all
is
begins in the southern German town of Herzogenaurach and a split between two brothers, the Dassler brothers. And they were both successful shoemakers. There was Adi, short for, unfortunately, Adolf, and Rudy. And they had a
short
25-year-old
for.
they had a 25-year-old company, the Gebruder Dassler Schuhfabrik, which had made shoes for Jesse Owens, amongst other people. And they became rival manufacturers on opposite sides of the river that flowed through the town. And the two giant shoe companies are still based there today, and they're a couple of miles apart. And how did they fall out? Well, there's lots of different versions of the story of the fallout, but the one thing that everybody agrees is that uh, the brothers during the Second World War were sharing an air raid shelter, and one night in 1943.
It's not feel good yet, Simon. I'm definitely
Okay.
not getting feel good. Dude called Adolf and brother, and now we're
Is
in
it,
the air shelter. Okay.
now I'm just going to ask, is it the mention of Adolf Hitler, the Second World War, and an air raid shelter that's not making you feel good at the moment?
Yeah. Where's this going?
Okay, bear with me because it gets better. I had to share an air raid shelter, and when one of the brothers came in with his wife, oh my God, here they come again. Now, she always contends that she was talking about the Allied bombers, but
Oh, okay.
the brother and wife who were coming into the shelter thought that they were talking about them. And that was it.
And
They
I, of course, would have just thought they were singing the Lars.
because if we cut you, you just bleed feel good about everything, don't you? That guy. So yeah, so they never spoke to one another again. And Adi went off and formed Adidas, and Rudy went off and formed Puma. And obviously both had massive success, but they didn't speak to one another again. And it split the town. You either worked for the Adidas factory or the Puma factory. And here's the feel good bit for you. They came together in 1996 to play a kind of healing football match. So the companies got together and said, let's have a football match to celebrate our wonderful town, the wonderful people in it, and our wonderful founders. And ever since then, they play a football match every year, and there's not that rivalry. But I just love that story.
So it's bonkers because I think what makes it a great story, not that we're here to deconstruct storytelling, is just because there are two brands we all know universally. also it brings the sadness that families can split like that over something so small and insignificant, maybe a misunderstanding. Um, but I don't know much about Adidas actually as a brand, other than, you know, it's very famous. But Puma I do know because Jochen Zeitz in, I think it was the 80s, he was the youngest CEO ever in Germany to run a company. And he introduced a really cool framework for how Puma was run, which was really, it sort of revolutionized business. And he looked at, you know, in terms of community, in terms of commerce, making money from a business, but really investing in people. And he did some interesting things. But anyway, I think that's a bonkers story that one small town in Germany is still home to the two of the biggest, what do we say, sneaker brands, sports brands in the world.
Yeah. And it's interesting as well, this kind of idea of sibling rivalry, the modern day sibling rivalry story that we're all glued to at the moment and have been for 10 years. Of course, the Gallagher brothers.
Yeah, of course, we're obsessed.
Do you remember, again, about 10 years ago, it must be coming up to 10 years ago, when Little Eddie Miliband stood up to Big Brother David?
Yeah.
And that in itself.
Well, it's so interesting how it totally alters the trajectory, well, not just their career trajectory, but it affects us all. Some people say that things might have been quite different. Yeah, it's so interesting. You're right.
What do you think it is that makes us fascinated by these familial fallouts? We don't feel the same. I don't think we feel the same about people saying, oh, I don't talk to my father anymore, or I don't really get on with my mother. We kind of, that's almost a given, I think, that my mother can be difficult or my father can be difficult.
This is a whole other fascinating conversation. I mean, especially from your perspective and mine, I'm an only child essentially, and I have someone I call my sister, but she was my ex-stepsister, chosen family. So I don't, from a first-hand point of view, I don't have any reference point for sibling rivalry, except for that, you know, that TV show Succession, which I can't watch because I find it so negative. These representations of these terrible, misanthropic, narcissistic people, it makes me sad, actually. I don't know how you feel. I mean, you don't have a conventional, what is conventional, but you might not have a typical take on sibling.
No, I mean, I was adopted at age 8 and kind of left siblings behind and gained a new sibling. And when people ask me about that, I kind of go, well, they're just people, aren't they? However, I am slightly obsessed by the soap opera that is the Gallagher brothers. And I love this story because obviously these two boys grew up together. And I think there's something incredibly interesting about people who have to share a small space together.
Gosh, what a fascinating observation. By the way, my friend Kat, after whom in a funny sort of way my daughter Kitty is named, was always Noam Carl and Liam's PA, and is still to this day Noel's. And I got together with Kitty's dad at her wedding, so that's why Kitty's called Kitty. So if you want the actual inside track, I'll connect you to Kat.
Well, yeah, we may have to call her one day on this show. But what's really interesting, there's a documentary that Liam Gallagher made, I think a couple of years ago, and he goes back to the family home to see their mother, Peggy, and he says, oh, come up and see the bedroom. And he says, here's our bedroom, and it's a tiny little room, and he says, my bed was there, Noel's bed was here, and this was the stereo, which one night I got up because I was drunk, thought I was going out of the corridor to the bathroom, but just walked over to the other side of the room and urinated over his record player and all his records. And he went mad, and then we had a fist fight. And he said, oh, I think that's the beginning of our rivalry. Somebody else who knows them put it much better in the documentary Supersonic and said, Noel has a lot of buttons and Liam has a lot of fingers. But sharing that small space together, you must think, as we all do, you know, if you've been in a relationship at all, I know that person better than anybody else. I know when that person is acting up to the crowd. I know when that person is doing X, Y, and Z. But of course, we're all much more complex than that.
So 2 things. One, Liam was quite simply born to be the person who gets a kick out of getting reactions. That's nature. Yeah. However, I would then wonder, I'm no neuroscientist and I'm no psychoanalyst, one would, I think, safely assume that something in his childhood, he was wired to be someone who needed to get, whether it's the, spike of certain chemicals in response to someone else's reaction. You don't want to sound judgmental. It's not healthy that you thrive off of winding someone else up, right?
Yes.
So that becomes about that. And I think, you look at a lot of people, I don't know, I'm watching This Is Us, but as an aside, a TV show, which is all about triplets with their relationship to,
Yeah.
and one is adopted. And the parenting, I'm in series 4, and I watched it all through lockdown, having not seen any of my family for over a year. I didn't see anyone in my family for 2020. It's like I'm reparenting myself and enjoying what it's like to have a family by watching this TV show. So I've become a bit obsessed with these sort of relationships. And ultimately, we all have our idiosyncrasies, and sometimes they work together, and it's a roll of the dice, and sometimes they don't. It's fascinating though. I think what we all have to do is always think, when I say this or do this, what is the outcome going to be, and what do I want it to be? So I think if we really care about the greater good and positivity, it's on us to think about, do I need to say this? What's the reaction going to be? What's the goal?
To bring it back to Adidas and Puma, that rivalry, the people of the town go, the great thing about that rivalry is we're famous. The town is famous and everybody's employed, and that rivalry sustains us. And that rivalry is so good for us. In some ways, we didn't want them to ever reconcile.
So go back to the word competition, and actually, I think the Latin word for which it comes from, competere, or whatever it is, it actually means pushing each other. So through the act of, if I had felt rivalry against an equivalent travel writer, let's say, I might see that they've done something, they've done a book, so I'm going to do a book. So ultimately, it pushes us both forward. And that's one positive way of looking at it. They both ended up pushing themselves because they want to outdo each other with 2 really amazing brands. So that is the positive product.
What do you think it is that makes us crave reconciliation, crave the happy ending?
Well, Disney programmed us to want that. I think if you came from an African tribe who was brought up on ancient African stories, you might feel differently. Or if you brought up in communist Russia, where I believe, from what I understand, in the past, they'd always show films at Christmas traditionally, which had unhappy endings because they were like programming you, because then you die and life is shit. But anyway, it's the Disneyfication of our storytelling, I think, wanting happy endings. But it's interesting because it resonated when Meghan Markle spoke out about how she doesn't speak to her dad. And then a journalist said, please respect that if we have chosen to not be in touch with our parents, which you mentioned, it is not us. Don't judge us for it. You're not even invited to judge us for it. I've gone through that. I've reached a point with my father where I'm not going to sit down strangers and explain to them, but I know if I did, they would say, wow, I really understand why it might be healthier for you to live a balanced life, not having that influence or force in your life. And it must be really hard for you and lonely and sad for you to not have that relationship with your parent. And you've elected that on balance, it's the best thing to do.
So do you think then that we should be more realistic, and that this conditioning, and it's interesting that you say that. I remember one of the very first films that I watched that didn't have a couple getting back together but was very funny was Mrs. Doubtfire, when Sally Field goes off with Pierce Brosnan, and actually we all think that Robin Williams is going to win back not only his kids but win back his wife as well. But do you think that's a good thing then, that we're conditioned?
Well, I think it's a balance, isn't it? It's so interesting you're saying. I think we all crave a happy ending. I think we all do, but I don't know about you, but when I watch films, rom-coms, you watch it because it's feel good. That's what definition of feel good is. But it's also quite refreshing when there are slightly more realistic situations. Because at the moment, as someone who's single throughout the last year, and I watch all these films where everyone has these great love affairs, and I feel like, wow, I really failed at quite a lot of love affairs in my life, and it ends up making me feel bad. So ultimately that feel good is feel bad for me in some ways. So it's interesting, but I'm sure a psychologist that we could ring would say it's human nature to enjoy the whatever it is the chemical is it the dopamine, or whichever the one is that you get from seeing them all cuddly and lovey dovey.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what we're craving, is that. So end of last year, 2020, crazy year, I read a book called Peace in the Age of Chaos. And it was by the guy who created something called the Global Peace Index. Have you ever heard of such a thing? A peace
I have
index?
not. I've
No?
a peace index,
Yeah.
like a league table of peace.
It is about, for countries, very specifically for countries,
Right.
nations. Yeah, so he ranked different nations. So Steve Killalea, Australian, he's a great guy who originally, he was a peacekeeper for many years. And so he created this index. And I thought it was so eye-opening. I mean, it makes you wonder what makes a country peaceful. How do you rank that? How do you measure it? So what do you think the most peaceful country in the world would be?
I would kind of automatically, and I don't know why, but I would automatically go to the South Pacific and go and look at those Pacific Islanders like the Tonga, Samoa, maybe even New Zealand.
So okay. I think all of us would go to the South Pacific right now if we could. I'm picturing, waters lapping up on soft, white, sandy beaches. Perhaps that's why. Actually, none of those, well, New Zealand ranks pretty high, but none of those rank in the top 10, apart from actually New Zealand. So think again. What might be a quality that would make a nation one of the most peaceful in the world? How about I tell you the qualities shared?
Okay.
And what they are. Okay. So the way he's measured it is the indicators are that the country is free of corruption. So that's going to eliminate a lot of countries. Exactly as you said. And the key thing is that they have a functioning government, also that they have a really robust economy and a fair distribution of resources. Now, so imagine that country, right? Everyone's contributing to a tax system because they want to, because they believe in those in charge. So that's going to be something that really helps it. So there's going to be a lack of violence, obviously. What now? Now, what are you thinking?
Now I'm Sweden or Denmark.
Well, okay, really high up there. They're actually the most peaceful country in the world, or should I say the country that ranks top of the Global Peace Index is, drumroll, Iceland. Now they have a head start in that they're a very small nation. Actually, there's been no internal conflict there since 1008 AD. And only 100 people died back then. So Iceland, number one. Number two, New Zealand. You are absolutely right. And I think the way that they honoured Indigenous rights, obviously, they had a whole peace treaty with the Maoris. That set the tone. And number three is Portugal is up there. Portugal. Yeah. You've also got Austria, Denmark, Switzerland. They're all up there. Now, exactly as you said, Scandinavian countries tick all those boxes. So it's really a really interesting way of looking at the world. Are we saying they're better? Are we saying they function better? I mean, I think peace is a pretty good goal, isn't it?
Yeah. Would you use the Peace Index as a reason to emigrate if you knew that it existed? Obviously, until you've told me about this, I didn't know that it existed, but it kind of is a bit like moving house and wanting to know that the schools around are good.
Totally. I mean, I think that's a really good point that you're making. I mean, whether you'd be able to afford to, because if they have a robust economy for the people who live there, I think you'd have to get a job. You'd have to guaranteed a job, that pays well within that country. What's interesting also in this particular book is that he says there isn't a direct correlation necessarily between peace and happiness. So obviously we hear lots about countries such as Bhutan saying they're the happiest. They measure their nation in terms of a happiness index.
That's really interesting that you say it's that the two things don't correlate. Would you, because if somebody said to me, what would you prefer? Would you prefer to live in a peaceful country, or would you prefer to live in a happy country? I think that surely happiness must be, happiness has got to be up. Happiness trumps peace. You would say that, wouldn't you? Or can you use
the T word?
Yeah, if I'm playing top trumps with you, okay? I'm playing top trumps.
Yeah.
you lay down your country and you say peace, and I go, "Ugh, peace trumps happiness." Does it though? Does peace trump happiness, do you think?
Well, it's like that conversation about what's the most important emotion to feel. You know, what is the most powerful emotion? Is it love? Is it, you know, all these things? And actually, it turns out the most powerful human emotion is a sense of belonging. So it's a really nuanced conversation. I think it's really interesting. I've just now Googled the happiest countries in the world. I'm sure, of course, there's a whole other index for that.
Oh, let me guess again. Let me guess again.
Yeah. Happiest countries in the world. Who do you think's top?
Okay, you know what? I am going to go back down to the South Pacific again, and I'm going to say New Zealand. I think they must be really happy because they've, I've seen The Hobbit. Look at that. Look at that landscape. And
You know what I'm saying? It's almost exactly the same as the peace index. So they do see a
no
correlation.
way.
Number one is Finland. I do know that 70% of Finland is forest. So I'm sure that connection with nature probably dictates that us human beings are naturally happier when we're better connected to nature, which is so interesting. And it says that our secret is in our nature. I thought so.
Wow.
So number 2 is Denmark again. Number 3 is Switzerland. These are places that are very connected to their natural landscapes, I have to say. They're not about big cities. You're obviously just desperate to get to the South Pacific. I think we all are. I feel like they were headhunting in lots of that parts of the world until only a few years ago. So I'm not sure how happy it genuinely is.
Have you ever thought about emigrating?
Well, I don't, because I'm a digital nomad. So back pre the pandemic, I was somebody who had the privilege and opportunity to pick up my laptop and go and live wherever I wanted in the world all the time. I often did that. You know, I even did it with my daughter. We went and lived in Bali, and she went to the Green School. I'm someone who lives like that anyway. So yeah, I mean, I do that. I love dipping into other cultures. I've lived in India for a spell. I've lived in New York. I've lived in spells in Greece. So yeah, I mean, I certainly don't stop and think, what is the happiest? Are they peaceful? I just think, where do I want to be? Where's the food great? Where's the landscape and weather great? I think that's how you measure it.
What's the Kinsman Index for a country then?
That's a great question. Well, of course, I would call them workations. So they're like, where would you want to go on holiday, but you can also work. So I would say, I think the reconnection with nature is major. So that's why I think you're being drawn to the South Pacific and those places. I
Right.
think the warm weather, a lot of the sort of Northern European countries are ranking the highest, interestingly, in terms of happiness and also peace. However, give me a sunbed.
Yes, because I mean, when you said Iceland,
Yeah.
and who knows, it may be the word ice in its title. I just thought, oh, that's going to be that's going to be cold, isn't it? And I think I'm drawn towards that the sunnier climes. I think I would be happier where I'm warmest.
Do you know, when you're talking about the senses and how we respond, I also think Iceland, volcanic rock, I don't think it has much soil, and it doesn't have much sort of like soft rolling green grass. And for me, one of the appeals and the things I loved about Bali, it wasn't the beaches, or people think of those postcard scenes. It was much more about the green paddy fields and seeing those verdant Kermit green fields blowing in the wind. That's what made me want to go and stay there. You're right. And they do not have that in Iceland.
What was at the bottom of the list?
The Global Peace Index.
Yes.
I'm afraid to say it's a lot of the poorest African countries, because
Right.
they don't have a history of solid governments. So you're going to see a lot of African countries, and it makes me sad because, of course, Malawi and Mozambique are 2 of the poorest countries in the world. But if you actually spent time with the people, as the tourist board will tell you for Malawi, they have the warmest hearts and the kindest people who, having, as a travel writer, I speak to people in all these destinations all over the world all the time, and I feel very connected to many of the 195 countries in our world. And in Malawi, it sounds very trite, but even though there's a pandemic and there's poverty, they really are people who are a lot of the people that I've seen in the communities are naturally optimistic and just appreciative of what they do have, rather than dwelling on what they don't have. But then I also spoke to someone in Nigeria who said, really, people don't have time to worry or think about sustainability or global warming. They're too busy thinking, where can I get my next buck to buy some lunch?
Yeah.
So perspective.